if you make changes that are seen as advantages to the exec team or to the organization, but if there are no clear benefits articulated for the shareholders, again, that could then provoke some negative feedback. And therefore, I think the key advice around communication, if you are on the REMCO of listed boards, is A, to over-communicate if possible, but also to be proactive, because the last thing that investors like is surprises.
Some of the things around fraud are sort of really quite staggering. It is the most common crime in the UK, and it's been increasing. In the records from the annual survey that goes through, in 3 years, it's gone from 13% of all reported crimes up to 39%.
A global survey that Marsh conducted of over 1,000 executives, and they were asked who was the primary owner of governing cyber risk, and 70% of respondents said actually the primary decision maker for managing cyber risk and governing it is the IT department, which it isn't right, can't be right. You can't govern risks at that level. It has to be governed by directors and the board.
There's a huge expansion of role, and I was just reading through briefly some of the questions that are being posed in the chat at the same time, and I think they kind of overlap with some of these concepts, which is when does that responsibility remain within the audit committee itself, and at what point and when and how should you start to peel that off into either its own committee or framework or its own kind of team that's either reporting back into audit or elsewhere.
The first sort of takeaway is who's your audience, and you've got to think of your book as being a business in itself. So who's your audience and how are you going to reach them? So how's it going to impact your wider situation to get you what you want? Because people will say, oh, I just want to get a book and see it up on Amazon. I'm going to retire off the royalties. Well, there's hundreds of thousands of books go up on Amazon every year. So not only do you need to put a bit more effort in when it comes to marketing, but you also need to understand where your book journey, what do you want it to do for you?
I think traditionally boards was kind of exclusively looking for people with 40 years career experience, ex-CEOs, financial accountants, and there just was a bit of a type of non-exec. And what I would say is a lot of those skills are still needed on boards, but the mix is changing.
How do you run the charity, and how do you manage the key relationship is the chair and the CEO? If that doesn't work, that causes all sorts of problems. So really, you need to understand who the CEO is, and do you feel that you can work with them? Because if that is going to be a problematic relationship, then it will be much harder to achieve the charity's aims.
What exactly is a zero-day exploit?
Oh yes, yeah, thanks for that, Tony. It's just quite simply when somebody doesn't know there's a vulnerability, and the day where they discover a vulnerability, then it's called a zero-day exploit. And normally, when a zero-day exploit is notified or flagged, the company whose software it is will develop what they call a patch. And a patch will ultimately fix that exploit or vulnerability, which could allow a third party to access the network or the software and the content of that software without going through the usual access control process.
I normally advise prospective NEDs to look at the current executive and current NEDs in the business and see what skills they have, what competencies they have, and whether you complement or perhaps conflict with those. It would also give you a general idea of where the business has been and perhaps wants to go to see whether you can get the business from A to B.
And it's as simply, you must perform to the best of your ability, which means that if there is a problem with the company, and our area of expertise, say in my case, is technology, and the problem that has happened has to do with something completely unrelated, I may get a green pass that, well, I wasn't such an expert in that field. But obviously, if this is something that is in my field, probably the regulator would look at it a little bit more closely. Still, our duty is not to interfere too much with the executive, but to be in the know of what happens and essentially document that we have taken the step. It goes from basic attendance and being prepared to saying, well, I saw this and it looked funny, therefore I did that, therefore I investigated.
All housing association roles are remunerated. So the smaller the association, the less likely it is that they're remunerated. And in fact, our prior pre-merger organisations had different approaches to this, but we're now of a sufficient scale to require professional, skilled and experienced board members who give up quite a lot of time. So we felt a couple of years ago this would be that we ought to start remunerating our non-exec directors, and we benchmarked that across the sector.